Among Britain's most eminent scientists of the 18th century was John Michell, the rector of Thornhill, a village near Dewsbury in the West Riding of Yorkshire. Michell was associated with some of the most famous scientists of the age, and he greatly contributed to the world of geology and astronomy, but has now been largely forgotten outside the rarefied atmosphere of the Royal Society and Queen's College, Cambridge. Born at the end of 1724, Michell grew up at Eakring, Nottinghamshire, the son of the rector, Gilbert Michell, and his wife Obedience. No contemporary portrait of John Michell exists. He was described as an intelligent, short, overweight man of dark complexion. But what he didn't possess in physique, he made up for in education. Michell took his mathematical tripos at Queen's College, Cambridge in 1749, and within a few months he had become a Fellow of Queen's College. In 1750, at 26 years old, Michell introduced the inverse square law of magnetism in his treatise on artificial magnets. His ideas based on reason rather than experiments, but correcting Isaac Newton's alternative and inaccurate model of magnetism. No one seems to have taken much notice of Michell's work, and the person later credited with the inverse square law in magnetism was Coulomb, more than 30 years later. Meanwhile, Michell built all his own experimental equipment, and his rooms at Queen's became cluttered with machinery. He now became quite unstoppable as an academic. Michell graduated as Master of Arts in 1752 and became a tutor of Queen's College until 1763, prelector or lecturer in arithmetic in 1751, censor in theology in 1752, prelector in geometry in 1753, prelector in Greek in 1755 and 1759, senior bursar in 1756, prelector in Hebrew in 1759 and 1762, and censor in philosophy and examiner in 1760. Michell's teaching duties would have taken up much of his time at Cambridge, but he also managed to fit in geology trips to the south of England along the Jurassic coast, which allowed him to gain an accurate understanding of the structure of the Earth's crust. He took a keen interest in all aspects of geology, and in 1760 published his earthquake paper, which was read in 5 instalments at the Royal Society. Its catchy title was Conjectures Concerning the Cause and Observations upon the Phenomena of Earthquakes, particularly of that great earthquake of the 1st of November 1755, which proved so fatal to the city of Lisbon, and whose effects were felt as far as Africa, and more or less throughout almost all Europe. Michell was the first scientist to propose that a tsunami results from the movement of rocks miles below the Earth's surface in a submarine earthquake, and that this causes the water to travel huge distances as waves. He was also able to estimate the location of the earthquake's epicenter. That year, some of the Fellows of the Royal Society, including Sir George Savile, Lord of the Manor of Thornhill, recommended him for membership, and he was duly elected on 12th of June 1760. Savile and Michell knew each other since being undergraduates at Queen's, and were close friends. Another new member of the Royal Society that year was Henry Cavendish, already famous for his discovery of hydrogen. Together he and Michell would collaborate in the future on matters of astronomy and physics. Michell also had frequent discussions with physicist, astronomer, mathematician and philosopher Rugier Josip Boscovic on the subject of magnetism. John Michell must have settled into a very comfortable existence at Cambridge, and he further graduated as Bachelor of Divinity during 1761. From 1762 to 64 he also held the Woodwardian Chair of Geology, and he could have spent a lifetime in academia, but he didn't. In 1764, something very unexpected happened. John Michell fell in love and married Sarah Williamson of Newark, who was in possession of a large fortune, enough to ensure that he needn't depend on his stipend for the rest of his life. The celibacy rule associated with his position at Queen's required him to give up his professorship on marriage. John Michell took a downward step to become rector of the sleepy village of Compton, just 3 miles from Winchester, where he studied the geology of the region. His only child, Mary, was born to Sarah on the 1st of August 1765, but sadly Sarah died on September 18th, aged only 38. During the 1760s, Michell developed a strong interest in astronomy and horology, the study of time. He was asked by the Board of Longitude to serve on committees evaluating chronometers, including the now famous Harrison chronometer. Harrison didn't seem to have much faith in some of the members of the Longitude Committee, especially the two that he referred to derisively as parsons, being John Michell and William Ludlam. The Board of Longitude chose Larkham Kendall's first marine timekeeper, known as the K1, in preference to Harrison's H4 chronometer, to accompany Captain Cook when he sailed to the Pacific. Early in 1767, and still only 42 years old, Michell travelled to Yorkshire, where he was appointed rector of the Church of St Michael and All Angels at Thornhill, sponsored by his good friend and influential lord of the manor, Sir George Savile. And that year, Michell gave a reading of his newest scientific paper on binary star systems, in which he suggested that double or multiple stars that are close together are bound together by gravitation, the force that attracts all objects towards one another. He thought this couldn't arise by chance, and predicted that many more incidences of such binary stars would be discovered. He speculated that our Sun is part of a star system which wasn't known at the time. He even pointed out that a knowledge of the period of orbital revolution, combined with their distance from the solar system, would provide a means of determining the mass of such a stellar pair, in comparison with the mass of the Sun. Michell's work on astronomy led the way for William Herschel to publish his own binary star observations in 1781. Herschel was another scientist whose patron was Sir George Savile of Thornhill, and he had briefly been organist at Leeds and then at Halifax Parish Church, 10 miles from Thornhill, before moving to Bath in January 1767. The two men probably missed each other by just a few weeks, though Michell's daughter always insisted that they had met then and that Herschel had learned about astronomy from her father. Also in 1767, Joseph Priestley became minister of Mill Hill Chapel in Leeds. Priestley and Michell came to know each other very well, living only about 10 miles apart. They got on well too, though Michell was High Church and Priestley was a Unitarian dissenter. They began a very friendly correspondence and met often. Priestley consulted Michell many times while writing his history and present state of discoveries relating to vision, light and colour, and said that he had been much assisted by Mr. Michell, whom he frequently visited at Thornhill, and was very happy in his society. John Michell settled down at last and remained rector at Thornhill for 26 years until his death. But during this time, he was not just content to be a parish priest. In fact, something quite remarkable happened at Thornhill Rectory on May the 23rd, 1771, which has only recently come to light. 4 years after his appointment as rector, John Michell put on a very special afternoon meal at the rectory and entertained some incredibly distinguished guests. Mitchell's best friend Joseph Priestley was present. Another guest was Jan Ingenhousz, who had become wealthy after inoculating the Austrian royal family against smallpox. Ingenhousz was now working on some of Priestley's ideas about oxygen, carbon dioxide and plant respiration, and he was to discover that green plants in sunlight convert carbon dioxide into oxygen. Mitchell's third guest was another long-established friend, the American scientist Benjamin Franklin, who became one of the founding fathers of the United States and founded the American Philosophical Society. Ben Franklin had already become famous because of his work on electricity and flying a kite in a storm to catch sparks. Among his many creations were the lightning rod, the Franklin stove, bifocal glasses, and the flexible urinary catheter. Franklin was strongly into politics and would become George Washington's right-hand man in the American Revolution. Earlier that day, Priestley had demonstrated some new experiments on electricity and gases at his own house in Leeds. Then they all travelled 10 miles to Thornhill, and perhaps Michell showed off his own apparatus and experiments. They would probably have talked both science and politics that day. The American Revolution was not too far off, and Franklin was in favour of America's independence. Priestley also held Republican views, and his house was later destroyed in an arson attack, after which he eventually decided to emigrate to America. Sir George Savile, Lord of the Manor of Thornhill, was also present. Who would have thought it? All those eminent people in Thornhill at one time, and absolutely nobody knew. It's been described as a tea party, but afternoon tea wasn't invented until 1840. So in 1771 the afternoon meal would be a full dinner, which was eaten between 3 p.m. and 5 p.m. It would have started with soup, then fish and meat courses, and followed by a dessert. And of course wine and port. Not too much fruit and veg, which wasn't popular at that time. As Michell was said to be a fat man, he must have greatly enjoyed his food, and it's likely that his table would have been plentifully supplied, even groaning, with the best that local butchers could provide. The party stayed overnight, and then they all went for a walk the next morning, past the ruins of the Saviles' ancestral home, Thornhill Hall, which had been destroyed in the English Civil War. They visited the newly built Calder and Hebble navigation, along with its designer John Smeaton, and then the rest of the party travelled on to Savile's cousin's home, Wentworth Castle, near Doncaster. How impressed must Ben Franklin have been to see the newly remodelled castle, but as a Republican would he have tactfully kept his thoughts about noble privilege to himself? With all this scientific research in his head, John Michell still made time to marry for a second time to Anne Brecknock on 13th of February 1773, when his daughter Mary was 7 years old, though there were no children of the second marriage. At last John Michell and William Herschel were definitely to meet. In 1781 they began to correspond about telescope mirrors. They were both constructing telescopes at this time and grinding their own mirrors. Michell and Herschel met occasionally at the Royal Society's rooms, or the Crown and Anchor Tavern in London, or the curiously named Cat and Bagpipes Chop House. In his scientific paper read on 27th November 1783, Michell first proposed the idea that there were such things as dark stars that were sufficiently massive and could generate such a strong gravitational pull that light would not be able to escape from them. The dark star would not be directly visible, but could be identified by the motion of a companion star if it was part of a binary system. Michell calculated that this would be the case with a star more than 500 times the size of the Sun. His ideas on dark stars were outlined within a letter to Cavendish in 1784. We now call this phenomenon a black hole, and it was only rediscovered in the 1970s. John Michell is now recognised as having had ideas 200 years earlier that were thought to be quite new to astronomy in the 20th century. During the 1780s, Michell continued to visit London on many occasions and to conduct experiments on gravitation at the rectory at Thornhill. One of his last and most important achievements was to build a torsion balance with which he intended to measure the mass of the Earth. However, his health was now failing badly, and he wasn't able to finish his experiments. John Michell died in 1793 at Thornhill. After his death, Michell's apparatus was passed on to Cavendish, who rebuilt it but kept very close to Michell's original plan. Its creation by Michell and later use by Cavendish is now considered to be the most important advance in understanding gravitation of the time, and has formed the basis of all the most significant experiments on gravitation ever since. However, it wasn't known as the Michell experiment, but as the Cavendish experiment. In 1910, Sir Edmund Taylor Whittaker, a British mathematician who contributed widely to applied mathematics and physics, wrote, "The only natural philosopher of distinction who lived and taught at Cambridge was Michell, although his researches seem to have attracted little or no attention among his collegiate contemporaries and successors, who silently acquiesced when his discoveries were attributed to others, and who allowed his name to perish entirely from Cambridge tradition." To many scientists, John Michell is now considered to be one of the greatest unsung scientists of all time. A great thinker and modest man whose ideas were taken up and published by other scientists, but who should not be forgotten for his contribution to the world of geology, physics, and astronomy. He was also my family's parish priest.